You are not allowed in here. Step back. Move away from the entrance.
I just want to see my son.
The security guard did not know her name. He did not know that the woman standing at the entrance of Bedford Village Inn had been awake since 5 in the morning ironing the only dress she owned that was good enough for today. He did not know she had taken 2 buses to get here. He did not know that the small envelope in her coat pocket had been carried through 35 years of warehouse floors and factory shifts, and that what was inside it would change everything that happened in that building for the rest of the day. He did not know that the woman he was about to turn away had paid for this day with her life. He did not know what the groom inside that building was about to lose. He just saw a woman who did not fit the frame. And in 30 seconds, he was going to make the worst mistake of this entire wedding. Amaris Adelle Duvane woke up at 5. Not because she set an alarm. Because 5 was what her body was already used to. 35 years of factory shifts written into her bones like a date carved into stone, permanent and involuntary, and not something that left you just because you had somewhere different to be. 5 was the alarm. 5 had always been the alarm. Even on the mornings when there was no shift, no bus to catch, no floor to get to, her eyes opened at 5 and she lay in the quiet of her apartment on Elm Street and listened to Manchester breathe in the dark before the city remembered what it was. Today, she didn't just lie there. She got up, put the coffee on, and stood at the window while it brewed. The street below was empty. Early October, the sky dark at the edges. She had stood at this window more times than she could count. Coat already on, bag already packed, watching exactly this street with exactly this expression. Waiting for the number 7 bus. Waiting for the shift to start. Waiting for the next thing the day required of her. She was still waiting, just for something different now. Her son was getting married today. She had known about the wedding for 7 months. Caleb called her one Sunday afternoon in March. His voice had that careful edge it got like he had been rehearsing what to say. Then he told her about Dominique, the date, the venue. Bedford Village Inn. She had written it down on the notepad she kept by the phone even though she did not need to write it down. She just needed something to do with her hands while he kept talking, and the shape of what he was saying became clearer and clearer until it was unmistakable. Mom, I need to talk to you about the guest list. She held the pen against the notepad. Okay. It's a small wedding. Very formal. There are going to be people there from the firm, from the city, people whose opinions matter to the business. I just want everything to go smoothly. Of course. He paused for a bit. The silence that meant the next thing was the thing he had actually called to say. I was thinking it might be better if you came to the dinner afterward. Instead of the ceremony. It might be easier. She was quiet for a moment. I understand. I'll make sure you have a great seat at the dinner. The best seat. That sounds fine, Caleb. She hung up and stood in her kitchen for a long time after. She understood what he was saying. She understood it instantly. 35 years of walking into rooms not meant for her had taught her that, knowing where she was welcome, where she was tolerated, and where she was just part of the background. Caleb was not cruel. He had never been cruel. He was a man who had spent 12 years building a version of himself that fit inside rooms she had never been invited into, and somewhere in that building he had stopped knowing how to hold both worlds in the same frame. Her world and his. The apartment on Elm Street and the offices downtown. The factory floor and the city council meetings. The woman who took 2 buses to work at 5 in the morning and the firm partner whose name appeared on buildings. He had not stopped loving her. He had just stopped being able to put her in the room. She understood it. She was still going. The coffee was ready. She poured a cup and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the envelope. It had been on the table since the night before, taken out of the drawer where she kept important things and placed there deliberately, where she would see it first thing this morning. Not that she could have forgotten it. Not that it had ever once left the back of her mind in 17 years. The envelope had been with her through every warehouse shift and factory floor and cold morning before sunrise. In her coat pocket on the hard days, in the drawer beside her bed on the others, in the bottom of her bag on the mornings when she needed it near her before she even knew she needed it. It was not new. The paper had gone soft at the creases from being opened and refolded so many times. The corners had worn to the texture of old cloth. She had protected it the way you protect things that cannot be replaced. Not framed, not behind glass, not preserved. Kept close. always close, because some things you do not preserve, you carry. Inside were two things. The first was a letter. Caleb had written it the night his college acceptance arrived. He was 18 years old. She had come home from a 16-hour double shift at the Brookside packaging plant, still in her factory clothes, and fallen asleep at this kitchen table before she could eat the food she had put on the stove. She had woken up at 4 in the morning to an empty apartment and a letter on the table in his handwriting. 18 years old. Unsteady in places the way young handwriting is when the feeling is bigger than the pen. She had read it standing at this table in the dark, still in yesterday's clothes. She had folded it carefully and put it in the drawer. She had not told him she still had it. Not because she was waiting for the right moment. Because she had understood, even then, that some things you carry for a person without telling them you are carrying it. You carry it so they can walk without the weight of it. You carry it so that what cost you everything costs them nothing. That was the job. That had always been the job. The second thing in the envelope was a photograph. Caleb crossing the graduation stage. Cap and gown. Someone in the crowd had caught him mid-step, his left foot forward, his head slightly up, smiling at something off to the left of the frame. He looked exactly like the boy she had raised and nothing like him at all simultaneously, the way children look when they finally become the thing you built them toward. She was not in that photograph. She had not been there that day. She had been on the floor at Brookside working a Saturday. One of those shifts you don't turn down when rent is due and your car insurance hits the same week. A coworker's daughter had been in the crowd with a camera. She had sent the photograph later without knowing what it meant to receive it. She had not known that Caleb had looked for his mother in the crowd that day. That he had assumed she had simply chosen not to come. He had mentioned it once carefully about a year later, something about understanding that she had been busy, that it was fine. She had opened her mouth to correct him. She had closed it again, because correcting him meant explaining. And explaining meant he would carry it. He would carry it into every good thing that came after, every project, every contract, every room where he stood and felt like he had earned it. And somewhere underneath the pride there would always be the knowledge that she had been on a factory floor the day he walked across that stage. And she did not want that for him. She had never wanted that for him. The whole point of 35 years of early mornings and double shifts and things she went without, the whole point was that he would not have to carry what she carried. On the back of the photograph, in her own handwriting, she had written 4 words the night it arrived. She had written them for herself. Private truth, addressed to no one. But today he needed to have them. He needed to have the letter and the photograph and what was written on the back before he stood at that altar and made promises to someone, because the man who made those promises should know exactly what he was made of and who had made him. She had waited for the right moment and finally understood that there was no right moment. There was only the moment you chose. She finished her coffee. She went to the ironing board. And she did not think about what would happen if he turned her away again. Her best dress was dark blue. $42 3 years ago. She had worn it twice. She ironed it the way she ironed everything, with care that was not performance but preparation. Every fold deliberate, every seam straight, because she was not getting dressed. She was preparing to walk through an entrance that had already decided who belonged, and she was going to walk through it looking exactly like who she was. Not an apology. Not a performance. A woman who had earned her right to be somewhere, whether or not the room had been told. The mirror showed her a woman of 58. Strong hands and calm eyes. The posture of someone who had been carrying weight so long it had become simply the way she stood. Not bowed by it, shaped by it, the way wood is shaped by the work it does over decades. She put on the dress. She put on the low black heels. She checked the envelope was in her coat pocket. She went to catch the bus. She had not told Caleb she was coming. She had rehearsed that conversation many times in the weeks before today. She had heard his voice go careful and then more careful. She had imagined herself agreeing not to come and spending this day in her apartment waiting for a phone call that would tell her secondhand how her son's wedding had gone. She was not willing to do that. She was going to give him the envelope. She was going to wish him happiness. She was going to leave. She had been clear with herself about that since March. That was the whole plan. The bus took 40 minutes. She sat near the window and watched Manchester move past. The streets she had walked and bussed and driven through for 30 years. so thoroughly mapped in her body that she could navigate them in the dark. The building where Brookside used to operate before it relocated south. The corner where she had stood in the dark every morning for 11 years waiting for the number 7. The cold coming off the Merrimack River 2 blocks over. Ordinary streets. The streets of a life she had built without help and without complaint. Block by block, shift by shift. Every dark morning adding another brick to something she had decided was worth building, even when she could not see the end of it. She thought about Caleb's father. Not often and not for long, but today she thought about him. He had never really been there. Not someone who left, but someone who chose early on not to show up at all. He had told her to end the pregnancy. When she refused, he had denied it was his and walked away from a fact he had helped create. And he had lived, as far as she could tell, without visible consequence. She had moved through her life carrying what he had put down. Not as a wound, it had stopped being a wound a long time ago. As a fact. The original fact from which everything else had followed. She had chosen Caleb's life when someone told her not to. She had chosen it knowing exactly what it was going to cost. Knowing she was going to do it alone. Knowing the mornings were going to be dark and the money was going to be tight and there were going to be nights when she could not see the end of it from where she was standing. She had chosen it anyway, and she would choose it again. Every single time. Without hesitation. Without condition. Without needing him to know how much it had cost. That was not sacrifice. That was just love, doing what love actually does when it is the real kind, quietly, completely, without an invoice. She watched the trees along the highway south of Manchester going gold and rust with October. She was almost there. She did not know yet that the entrance had already made its decision. Bedford Village came into view through the trees on Meetinghouse Road. The white clapboard buildings. The lanterns along the path. The manicured grounds that spoke the language of money that has learned to look effortless. She had studied photographs of this place in March, sitting at her small desk in the bedroom, and she had looked at them for a long time, not with envy, not with bitterness, with something closer to recognition. This was the world her 35 years had built access to. Not for her. For him. That had been the whole point of the building. She got off the bus at the corner and walked the last 2 blocks. Cars lined the drive. Guests in formal clothes moved toward the entrance in pairs. A string quartet was already playing somewhere inside, the sound of a day that had been planned down to every last detail. She straightened her coat. She checked the envelope was in her pocket. She had worked 35 years for this day to exist. She walked toward the entrance. The security guard was doing his job. He was a professional. He was managing an entrance. He looked at the woman approaching without a car, without a companion, with a coat that was clean but not expensive, and he made the assessment and stepped forward. "Good morning, ma'am. This is a private event." "I know. I'm the groom's mother. I just need a few minutes with him. I have something to give him. I'm going to need to see your invitation." "I don't have an invitation. I was supposed to come to the dinner this evening. But I just need 5 minutes." 2 guests moved past toward the entrance. A couple in expensive clothes, moving like they'd never had to explain themselves at any door. The woman said something to the man as they passed. Not loudly. She did not need to be loud. The man glanced at Amaris, one quick assessment, the kind that takes less than a second and costs the person making it nothing, and looked away. The woman smiled at what she had said. A second couple passed. They did not look at Amaris at all. That was its own kind of statement, the studied absence of acknowledgement that is not ignorance but choice. The entrance had made its verdict. The guests were simply agreeing with it. Amaris heard all of it. She remained calm. She had been keeping her face still in moments like this her entire life. Not this entrance, but this moment. This exact type of dismissal. The factory supervisor who spoke past her to the man beside her. The warehouse manager who called her by the wrong name for 6 months and corrected himself only when she stopped responding. The landlord who had asked her, twice, whether she was certain she could afford the apartment. She had learned early that showing what she felt in moments like these cost more than the moments were worth, and she had learned to keep her face still the way she had learned everything else. Through repetition. Through necessity. Through the slow accumulation of mornings that gave her no other option. "Please." Her voice was level. 5 minutes. I'll give him something and I'll leave. I'm not asking to stay. The guard opened his mouth. And then Caleb was at the entrance. She watched it happen in his face in 2 seconds. He recognized her right away, before he even knew what to do. She was watching carefully. She had been watching his face her entire life, and she knew every configuration of it, including the one she was looking at right now. He was standing between 2 versions of himself. He had a choice. He wore the tuxedo like it was nothing, like he'd always known how to stand in a place like this. She forced herself not to look away because it was true. He belonged here now. It hadn't always been like that. It took 12 years to get here, and she'd helped him do it. Gave him the time, the support, everything he needed. Part of her still felt proud of that. The rest of her was watching him choose. He stepped outside. He pulled the door almost closed behind him, keeping the conversation off the entrance, away from the guests still arriving, away from the people whose opinions mattered to the business. That detail alone told her everything about the calculation he was making. His voice was low. "Mom, I asked you not to come. I know." She took the envelope from her coat pocket. "I brought you something. For today." He looked at the envelope. He did not take it. Today isn't really." He stopped. Adjusted. His eyes moved briefly to the entrance behind him, checking who was there, who could see, who from the firm might be arriving in the next 60 seconds. "There are people here. From the firm. From the city. People whose. I know who's here." Her voice did not change. "I'm not here to embarrass you. I'm here because you're getting married, and there's something in this envelope you need to have before you go in there and make promises." He looked at the door, then at her, then at the door. The guests kept arriving behind him. Every second he stood outside with her was a second someone from his world could see it. Could see the woman in the $42 dress and the sensible heels and draw conclusions about what that meant and who she was to him. She could see him feeling that. She had always been able to see when her son was calculating the cost of her. "I'll call you tonight. We'll do dinner this week. Somewhere nice." She looked at him. 35 years. Factory floors. A graduation stage watched from a conveyor belt. And here was her son, in his tuxedo on his wedding day, managing her the way he managed difficult conversations in boardrooms. Smoothly, kindly, with a dinner reservation as the offer of settlement. She did not say any of the things she could have said. She took the envelope and placed it in the breast pocket of his tuxedo herself. His hands were at his sides. He did not stop her. She smoothed the pocket flat with her palm. The same gesture she had used 1,000 mornings sending him out into the world, making sure everything was in its right place before she let go. Her hand lingered there for 1 second on the pocket where the letter was. On the thing she had carried 17 years. On the promise he had made at 18 that was now resting against his chest. Then she turned and walked to the steps. She did not look back. She sat down in her best dress with her purse in her lap and her hands folded and looked at the road in front of her. She did not cry. She had not come here to cry. She had done the part that was hers. She had given him the thing. Whatever happened next was his. It had always been his. She had spent 35 years making sure of that. Inside Bedford Village Inn, in the groom's suite on the 2nd floor, Caleb Elias Duvane had been standing at the mirror for 20 minutes before any of this happened. The room was everything Elm Street was not. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking grounds that had been manicured by people whose names nobody knew. A mahogany dressing table with a silver tray holding cufflinks that cost more than a month of Amaris's shifts. Champagne in a silver bucket that nobody had touched. The kind of room designed to make whoever stood in it feel that what they were about to do was important and witnessed and permanent. A room that cost more per hour than Amaris made in a week, assembled by hands that would never be invited inside it. Caleb looked like he belonged here. That was the thing. He had spent 12 years learning exactly how to stand in rooms like this without showing the seams. The way he accepted a cufflink from the silver tray without examining the price. The way he stood at a window overlooking those manicured grounds as though the view belonged to him, was not performance. It was learned. He had worked at it the way he had worked at everything, with focus, because belonging somewhere was not something that happened to you. It was something you built. He had earned his way out of the kitchen table on Elm Street and the school buses and the one-bedroom in Concord with proposals covering the floor. He did not apologize for the distance between that and here. He just did not always know what to do with remembering. Eldrin was at the window, champagne glass still full. He had been watching the grounds below without speaking for the better part of 10 minutes. Eldrin Hayes had known Caleb for 11 years, had been in every room where Duvane and Hayes Civil Engineering had become what it was. He was the kind of man who said less than he knew and knew more than he said, and he had the patience to wait for you to arrive at things rather than pushing you toward them. He had asked about Amaris 40 minutes ago. One question. Your mother coming? Caleb had said she was coming to the dinner. Eldrin had looked at him for a moment and looked back out the window and said nothing else. He was still saying nothing. Caleb straightened his tie. Stop, Eldrin said. Stop what? That's the 5th time. Caleb put his hands down. He looked at the window, the white chairs being arranged on the lawn, the arch of flowers, the whole careful architecture of a day that had been planned for 8 months. He had expected to feel ready. He was ready to marry Dominique. That certainty was bone deep and had been for 2 years. What he had not expected was the other thing. The thing that had been sitting in his chest since he woke up and had not moved. He had known what it was for 7 months. He had not let himself look at it directly. You want to know what I keep thinking about? Eldrin said. Not a question. Caleb said nothing. The photo in your office. On the bookshelf. The woman in the hard hat at the Concord Bridge opening. He turned from the window. Standing in the rain, 3 hours from home, because her son built something and she came to see it. It was. She drove 3 hours in the rain to watch concrete get poured. He looked at Caleb directly. The way he looked at things in boardrooms when he had decided to say the real thing. She is not at your wedding. Caleb started to speak. You build for a living, Caleb. Not harsh. Just true, the register Eldrin used for things that did not need decoration. You have spent 11 years telling cities what happens when the foundation is left out of the plan. When the structure goes up and the thing underneath it gets treated as though it can wait. He looked at his partner of 11 years without flinching. What you did this morning is the same thing you spend your career telling other people not to do. You left the foundation out. The room was quiet. The coordinator's voice came through the door. 15 minutes. Caleb put on his wristwatch and went downstairs. He did not know what was waiting at the entrance. He would find out in 3 minutes. And it would change everything that came after. Dominique Celeste Lucian had been a family court judge in New Hampshire for 3 years. She had seen, in those 3 years, the mechanics of how families failed each other. Not in the dramatic ways people imagined, but in the quiet accumulating ways that took years to become visible and required a courtroom to contain the aftermath. She had listened to mothers describe what they had given and watched those descriptions be minimized, filed away, treated as beside the point by people who had never once had to count the cost of what they were dismissing. She had become a judge because of her mother. Ruth Lucian had farmed 22 acres in Hillsborough County for 30 years. Real farming, before light to after dark, paid in the currency of land that was always one hard season away from taking more than it gave. Ruth had done it alone after Dominique's father left when she was 4. She had done it without asking for help from anyone who was not already offering. Dominique was 25 when her mother's health began deteriorating. She had just passed the bar. She had sat beside her mother's bed in a hospital in Concord on a Tuesday in November and held her hand and told her about the bar results. And Ruth had smiled the smile of a woman who had been holding on for exactly this piece of news and could finally rest. Ruth never saw the courtroom. She had died of high blood pressure at 51. She never saw the robe. Never saw a single case. Never got to watch Dominique do the thing Ruth had spent 30 years farming to make possible. Dominique carried that into every decision she made. Not as grief, but as an instruction. As the permanent answer to the question of what she was doing and why. She was near the entrance to the main hall when she caught the end of what was happening at the door. She turned and saw Caleb's back and a woman in a dark blue dress and the posture of a conversation going wrong. She watched Caleb go inside. She watched the woman sit down on the steps. Dominique stood frozen. She knew that face. Not this woman. She had seen only photographs of Amaris taken years ago. But that face, the chin up, eyes forward, hands folded, the whole body organized into the kind of composure that is not composure but the last thing you have left when composure is all there is. She had seen that exact face on her mother, sitting across from a bank manager on a Tuesday in March when Dominique was 14, with 22 acres of receipts in a manila folder, while the man behind the desk spoke to her with the patient condescension of someone who had already decided and was just completing the paperwork of it. Ruth had sat with her chin up and said thank you when he finished. She had walked to the truck without speaking until they were moving. Then, quietly, looking at the road ahead, some rooms are not designed for people like us. That does not mean we do not deserve to be in them. Dominique had never forgotten it. She found Caleb near the entrance hall. She stood in front of him and waited until he looked at her. That was your mother. Not a question. He started to explain. She let him say all of it, the dinner plan, the guest list, the people from the firm, the importance of the day running without complications. She had heard every version of this particular speech in courtrooms. It never explained what the person giving it believed it explained. When he finished, she was quiet for one while. Then, every building you have ever put your name on started with a foundation that no one could see once the structure was complete. The foundation does its work in silence. It holds everything above it and asks for nothing and is invisible to everyone who benefits from it. She looked at him without looking away. Your mother is that foundation, Caleb. She has been doing that work since before you knew what work was. And the man I am about to marry is either the man who knows that and lives accordingly, or the man who just asked his foundation to wait outside while he accepted the praise for the building. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten to leave. She did not issue an ultimatum. She said the true thing and she walked away, because the truth did not need her standing next to it to do its work. Caleb stood alone in the entrance hall of Bedford Village Inn. He reached up and touched the breast pocket of his tuxedo. He felt the envelope. He walked to the corridor. The service corridor off the main hall was narrow and quiet. This was the service corridor behind the elegance. There was a mop and bucket in the corner. A folding table with cleaning supplies. The smell of industrial cleaner. He stood in it for a moment. He thought about who cleaned these floors. He thought about what it meant to spend your life making rooms look effortless for people who never thought about what it cost. He thought about it for 1 second and then he took out the envelope. He opened it. His own handwriting. He was 18 years old. He had come home to find his mother asleep at the kitchen table in her factory clothes with the stove still on and a pot of food gone cold. He had turned the stove off. He had stood at that table and looked at her. He started reading. He read about the mornings. The coat on the hook at 4:30. The sound of the door closing. A sound so written into his childhood that even now, in the wrong building on the wrong kind of morning, if a door closed at that particular hour, something in him registered it as the sound of her leaving for work. He read about the smell of her clothes when she came home, industrial cleaning products and machine oil, a smell he had not thought about in years and now smelled completely, as if she were standing next to him in this corridor in her work clothes, exactly as he had seen her 1,000 times. He read about the Tuesday when he was 11 and needed a permission slip signed for a school trip and she was not home. He had forged her signature and felt terrible about it for 3 weeks until he confessed, and she had looked at him and said, he remembered the exact words, the next time just call me and I will come home on my break. He had not known until that moment that she had breaks. He was 11 years old and had not known his mother was allowed to stop. He kept reading. At the part where he had tried to find language for what he felt watching her sleep at the kitchen table, watching her in her factory clothes with her head down and her hands resting, his voice changed. Not all at once. A tightening. A quality entering the reading that had to do with the distance between the boy who wrote these words and the man who was reading them, and everything that distance contained, and what it meant that the distance had grown so large without him noticing it was growing. He got to, I am going to give you everything. Not because you asked. Because you never asked. Because you worked 16-hour shifts and fell asleep in your factory clothes and never once made me feel like I owed you anything for it. I am going to give you everything, and when I do, you are not going to have to take 2 buses anywhere ever again. His voice stopped. He stood in the corridor holding his own words and could not continue. The words he had written at 18. The words he had meant completely. The words that were supposed to be a living commitment and had somewhere become, without his noticing, something he visited occasionally. A version of himself from long ago that he could access in memory but no longer lived inside. He had not given her everything. He had given her dinners, phone calls, carefully worded explanations for why the most important day of his life did not have a seat for her in it. He stood in that corridor and felt the full weight of what he had become so gradually he had never once decided to become it. Not a villain. Not someone who had chosen this. Just a man who had made 1,000 small choices, each reasonable in isolation, that together had built a wall between himself and the woman who had chosen his life before he had one. He was standing in a service corridor, maintained by people nobody thought about. He thought about that. Then he saw the photograph, still in the envelope, tucked against the side. He had almost missed it. He reached in and took it out, himself crossing the graduation stage, left foot forward, head slightly up. Smiling, he remembered exactly what at. His roommate Deshawn's sign. Dr. Duvane? Wrong on 2 counts, catching him at exactly the wrong moment. He remembered that day. He remembered his mother had not been there. He had told himself she had probably had a shift. He had been 22 and the day had been full and he had never asked directly. And then enough time passed that asking felt strange, and then more time and it became simply part of the record. She had not been there. It was fine. These things happened. He turned the photograph over. For words. His mother's handwriting. I was there anyway. He read them once. He could not read them again immediately. He understood what they meant. Not gradually, not through reasoning. All at once. The way a door opens onto something that has been waiting on the other side for years. She had been on the floor, at Brookside, standing at a conveyor belt while he crossed that stage. She had not told him because she had not wanted him to carry it. Had not wanted his graduation memory to include the knowledge that the woman who built his access to it was not in the crowd but on a factory floor, so the rent would be paid and the car insurance would not lapse and everything in the background of his life would keep functioning, silently, without acknowledgement, without invoice. He put his back against the wall of the corridor. He slid down until he was sitting on the floor in his tuxedo. He sat there and felt all of it. Not just this morning, not just the entrance, but the phone call in March and the 7 months of telling himself the dinner would be enough and the 12 years of slowly, without deciding to, making her smaller in the frame of his life until she was small enough to ask to wait outside. He had not decided to become this man. He had become him through accumulation. He had once been someone who saw her completely. He had stopped seeing her so gradually he had never noticed he was going blind. He stood up. He walked to the entrance. She was still there. He had half expected to come to the door and find the steps empty. He had braced for the grief of that, the finality of having gone too far. But she was there. Dark blue dress, purse in her lap, hands folded. It was the posture he'd known his whole life, not defeated. Just composed, holding herself there until whatever came next arrived. He sat down beside her, the way he used to sit beside her at the kitchen table when he was small and had something to say and did not know how to start. She did not look at him immediately. You wrote on the back of the photograph. She turned. I was on the floor that day. I didn't want you to think I chose not to be there. He looked at his hands. Why didn't you tell me? Any of it. All these years. Why didn't you just tell me? She looked at the road. Because you were building something. I didn't want my sacrifices to become your debt. I wanted them to be my gift. A gift doesn't come with an invoice. If I had told you every shift, every morning, everything I went without, you would have spent your whole life feeling like you owed me. And I didn't want that. I wanted you to build freely. Not just the money, the freedom. She looked at him. That was what the 35 years were for. Not to make you grateful. To make you free. He said nothing for a long moment. The letter. I meant every word of it. I know you did. Not reassurance. You were 18 and you saw me clearly. You wrote what was true. Her voice was steady and even and without accusation. And then life got bigger and the rooms got more expensive and the distance between where you started and where you arrived grew wide enough that you stopped being able to see both ends of it at the same time. I don't hold it against you. She looked at him directly. But I needed you to have that envelope before you went in there. Because the man who makes promises today should know what he is built from. He took her hand. She let him. They sat on the steps of Bedford Village Inn on an October morning in New Hampshire while the string quartet played and the guests found their seats on the lawn and the world went on doing what it always did. Completely indifferent to the two people on the steps finishing something that should have been finished long ago. Then she said the thing she had been carrying since before he was born. Not as an accusation. Not with drama. Just as a truth that belonged to both of them. The man who told me to get rid of you, she said quietly, is not in this room today. He has never been in any room that mattered. He chose himself, and he has lived with that however he has lived with it. She looked at her son. But I am here. I chose you before you could choose anything. I chose you when someone I trusted told me not to. I chose you when I did not know how I was going to do it alone, and I chose you every morning after that. Every double shift, every bill, everything I went without and never counted. Her hand tightened on his. You are not unwanted, Caleb. You have never been unwanted. Not for 1 second of your life. There was exactly one person who had the chance to decide that, and she is sitting on these steps, and she has never once regretted the answer she gave. Something moved through his face. Not tears exactly, something older than tears. The expression of a person receiving something they have needed their entire life and did not know they had been waiting for. He stood up. He held out his hand. She looked at it. Then she took it and stood. You have a wedding to get to. We have a wedding to get to, he said. She looked at him. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, something past a smile. Something that had been waiting a long time for the right version of a moment and was watching it arrive and was not going to rush past it. She took his arm. Before any of this had begun, before the morning became what it became, Dominique had done one quiet thing. She had walked into the ceremony space before anyone else arrived and stood at the front row center seat and placed a single white flower on it. No explanation. No announcement. She had placed it there and walked away, because it was not a gesture designed for an audience. It was something she did for herself and for the woman she had never met, who she had known, from the moment Caleb first described his mother 8 months ago, was the most important person who would walk into this building today. She had known because of how he talked about her. He talked about his mother the way people talk about things they have put in a drawer, quickly and past the surface of it, moving on before the feeling could catch up. The factory shifts, the apartment. The way he rushed through it and quickly changed the subject. She'd heard that before. In courtrooms from people describing sacrifices they did not yet know how to carry. In her own voice sometimes, talking about Ruth. She had known that the front row center seat was Amaris Duvane's. She had known that Amaris was going to be in it. Not certainly how, just certainly. She heard them before she saw them. The shift in the room's ambient sound, the silence that falls when something is happening that commands attention without requesting it. She stepped to the doorway. Caleb was walking through the entrance with his mother on his arm. Amaris in her dark blue dress. Hand in the crook of her son's arm. Moving through the same entrance she had been turned away from an hour ago. Through the same door, past the same threshold. With the bearing of a woman who has never needed a room's permission to deserve to be in it. The guests near the entrance stepped back without deciding to. Not parting for ceremony. Just the room making space the way rooms make space when something has shifted in what they contain. The couple who had smiled. The guests who had looked away. All of them stepping back now without quite knowing why, because the thing that had felt settled an hour ago was no longer settled and everyone in that entrance hall could feel it even if none of them could have said what had changed. What had changed was simple. The woman the room had rejected had come back. And this time she had the groom's arm. Dominique watched her walk in. She thought about Ruth sitting across from the bank manager with her calloused hands and her 22 acres of receipts. She thought. She would have recognized this woman immediately. She thought. She would have known her by the way she holds herself. Caleb walked his mother to the front row center. She saw the flower from 3 steps away. She stopped. She picked it up. She turned it in her fingers. She looked across the room. Dominique was standing in the doorway in her wedding dress. Their eyes met. Dominique gave her the smallest nod. Nothing else. No words. No performance. Just the nod, one woman to another. across a room full of people who had no idea what it meant and did not need to. Amaris nodded back. She sat down in the center seat of Bedford Village Inn. She took the envelope from her coat pocket. She took out the photograph, her son mid-step on a graduation stage, smiling at something off to the left of the frame. She placed it in her lap. She had carried it for 13 years. Through Brookside, through the warehouse on the South End, through the cold mornings and the double shifts and the evenings when she came home and sat at this same kitchen table and felt the particular weight of being the only person who knew the full cost of the thing she had chosen. She held it now and looked at her son standing at the altar. He was looking at her. She thought about a night 35 years ago when someone had told her the life growing inside her was a problem to be solved. She thought about her answer, the absolute immediate quality of it. Not a decision, just a recognition of the only thing that was true. She thought about every morning that had followed that answer. Every shift, every bill, every permission slip she had signed and every school bus she had put him on and every graduation stage she had watched from a factory floor and every dinner reservation she had said sounds fine to when what she meant was I am still here. She thought, I was there anyway. She thought, I have always been there. She thought, look at what we built. The music changed. Dominique stood at the altar with Caleb, exchanging vows. And Amaris Adelle Duvane sat in Bedford Village Inn on a Saturday morning in October, with a white flower in one hand and a photograph in her lap, and watched her son get married. Caleb Duvane asked his mother not to come to his wedding. She came anyway. He saw her clearly at 18. He sat across from her sleeping at the kitchen table in her factory clothes, and he wrote down everything he saw and everything he promised, and he meant every word. He left it for her to find in the morning. Then the rooms got bigger, and somewhere in the widening distance between where he started and where he arrived, he stopped being able to see both ends of it. Not deliberately, not cruelly, just gradually, the way foundations are taken for granted when the building above them is going up and the thing underneath is doing its job quietly and without asking to be noticed. He made her smaller, one reasonable choice at a time, until the woman who had chosen his life before he had one was being offered a seat at the dinner instead of the ceremony. That is not a story about a bad son. It is a story about what happens to all of us when the rooms keep getting bigger and we keep looking forward and we stop looking back at the people who built our access to all of it. There is someone in your life right now who is still there, still showing up, still holding something for you in silence, without invoice, the way Amaris held that envelope for 17 years. You know who it is. The steps are still there. You know the way back. If this story opened something in you, send it to the person it made you think of. If it reminded you of someone who never stopped showing up, let them know you see it. If it hurts because it was true, don't leave it here. Subscribe to Storytelling Empire. New educational and inspiring stories every week. See you in the next one. Love you.